Next on Garden Line, we learn about different ornamental grasses that can be used in the landscape.
They just have this nice green and white foliage.
Funding for Garden Line is provided in part by your membership in the Friends of South Dakota Public Broadcasting. And by Swiftel Communications.
Hello and welcome to Garden Line. I'm Stephen Monk. Tonight on our show, we'll go on location with Extension horticulturalist David Graper, who will highlight grasses that can be used to decorate yards and landscapes. And as always, our panel of lawn and garden experts are here to answer your questions with the most up-to-date information about gardening, lawn care, insects, trees, and a host of other lawn and garden-related concerns. So get ready to call in. The phone number for you to call in is 1-866-595-SDSU. Again, that is 1-866-595-7378. Joining me in the studio to answer your questions is John Keycafer, Brookings County Extension Educator, David Graper, Extension Horticulturalist, Connie Tandy, SDSU Plant Diagnostic Clinic, and Mike Meckning, Extension Weed Specialist. Helping answer the phones tonight are the Watertown Master Gardeners. And remember, when you call in with your questions, please provide the phone volunteers with as much information as possible about your garden problem. Be ready to provide a description of the problem, when the problem first appeared, whether it's affecting any other surrounding plants, and moisture and or soil conditions that exist. But first off, we're going to go around the table and hear from our panel on what is currently happening out there. And we're going to start with John Keycafer.
I'm glad you didn't say what's currently happening in gardens, because I kind of stretched things tonight a little bit. I brought in an example of something that I probably get more calls on than anything else, but you're not likely to find this in a garden bed. You might find this in your other bed. I brought in some video of bed bugs. These are fairly common insects in South Dakota now, unfortunately. And these are things that are moving from place to place and person to person. And of all of the sorts of creatures that we have out there, these are some of the few that you're very unlikely to find outside. If you do have a bat house up and you're looking around underneath that bat house, you may find some things that look like these. Chances are those are going to be bat bugs instead of bed bugs. But the bed bugs that we see are typically going to be found inside homes, inside buildings. They want to be around where people are sleeping. And like I said, I deal with a lot of calls on these. People are very concerned with how to get rid of them. They transfer from person to person in hotels as you move from one apartment or one house to another. They'll move on clothing, on items that you take with you. They like upholstered furniture. They like bedding. And because of it, they're fairly easily moved in some of these places where we have a lot of the population moving from one place to another. If you stay in hotels and motels frequently, it is another possible place for them to come in, but it's certainly not the only place that you can get them. So if you're thinking of trying to protect yourself from getting these things a little bit, best thing to do, make sure you do check any of those places where you might be spending a night. Make sure that you don't have an infestation there when you come in. Try to prevent them from coming home with you if you can. Don't throw articles of luggage on a bed or on the floor. Keep them up a ways. Use luggage racks up on the wall or hang them up somewhere so that hopefully bed bugs can't get up into them quite as easily. And if you do have real concerns about them, you can certainly run everything that you've got through a hot dryer or through a hot wash cycle and then through a dryer. Heat will kill them, and that's the most effective way we have of dealing with them if they get into a house too. You know, you want to talk to an exterminator. Some of the big extermination companies now are offering heating specials where they will literally heat the entire house to 140 degrees for a few hours, and that's high enough that it ends up killing off those bed bugs that are in there.
John, I understand that bed bugs have really made a resurgence. over the numbers that we've had in the past. Why is that?
The idea at one time was that DDT would take care of them, and for a number of years it seems to have taken care of them. We did end up banning DDT, and a lot of people assume that if we were to just bring DDT back that we'd be able to get rid of them again. That doesn't seem to be the case at all. The bed bugs that we see now that are moving around from place to place are completely resistant to DDT, and they can withstand a number of other chemicals because of that resistance to DDT. So we could bring back any number of chemicals and it wouldn't do a whole lot of good against them. One of the biggest changes that entomologists report, at least anecdotally, is that they seem more likely to jump onto things and more willing to move. And certainly the females that are ready to go lay eggs are more willing to move than other bed bugs. And so they climb onto bags or onto backpacks or other items that you might have with you and are willing to go along for that ride and see where they end up.
I know we get a number of samples in the office. A lot of times the owners or homeowners or whoever brings in the insects, they really associate this with sanitation, and we kind of indicate that's really not so much related because we wash our floors and we pick up dust and so on. But
I would guess that the bed bugs appreciate that. They certainly don't mind a clean place. They're not there because it's clean or dirty or otherwise. They're there because their food is there, and it's an item that we talk about, or a topic that we talk about a lot with garden insects as well. They go where the food is. In this case, bed bugs' food is humans. And so if there's a place where people are sleeping, they're likely to do quite well there.
Okay. Thank you, John. David, what do you have for us?
Well, I want to talk a little bit about water. And we've had a lot of discussions about water over the course of the summer with the excess rainfall we had earlier this season and all the flooding that we've had in so many areas around the state. But now we're getting to a point where that water is receding. So we're starting to see some of the lingering effects of that water dissipating. We're going to see a lot of damage showing up on trees. And a lot of people might think, well, if it's sitting in water, the damage is probably going to show up right away. But in fact, those trees that were underwater or the shrubs that were underwater may linger for several months or even a few years before they finally end up actually dying. But you're going to see conifers, evergreens turning brown, turning kind of a reddish or rusty color. That's going to be a good indication that you've probably got some damage there. You're going to see leaf loss, early fall coloring on a lot of trees that were underwater. Just general stress kinds of symptoms. Next spring, you'll probably see a lot more dieback, a lot more winter injury showing up in some of those plants. And we might start seeing some other insect infestations showing up in some of those plants that have been under stress as well. So this is going to be an ongoing process with the trees and shrubs to see where that damage shows up. As far as some of the smaller plants, the herbaceous plants, most of those probably are already dead. If they were underwater for several weeks, they probably aren't going to make it. And certainly turf areas, there's going to be a lot of work to be done to try to replenish those turf areas, those lawn areas. If you've got a lot of leftover silt in those areas, you have to deal with that. Either get that incorporated into the soil somewhat if you can to try to get rid of that interface that might be there, and then look at reseeding, maybe do some soil sampling to try to see what kind of situation you're working with. It's going to be a very difficult process over the next few weeks. And in the meantime, we've been getting some dry weather over the last few weeks. We've had some light showers come through the Brookings area and through parts of South Dakota over the last day or so. But in a lot of cases, we got trees and shrubs and plants out there, turf areas that are kind of suffering from a lack of water now in most areas. So it's a good idea to get that water out, or get the water out on those trees and shrubs. Now is when they're preparing for winter. The shortening days kind of trigger various responses within those plants. We're going to start storing up carbohydrates and so forth, and getting ready for that winter process to go through. And they need to be not in a stressed condition for that to work the best. So if you've not had rainfall in several weeks and you're starting to see those big cracks and so forth in the ground, probably a good idea to get that sprinkler out there, get that soaker hose out there around your trees and shrubs, and give them a good thorough watering here over the next few weeks to try to help them avoid some of that stress and therefore better survive the winter.
Okay. Now, you mentioned give a good thorough watering to the trees. What do you mean by that? How would you advise a homeowner on how long and how much?
Well, you generally are going to need to probably do a little checking around. If you've got the point where the soil is dry and you've got cracks where you can start to stick your hand down in there and so forth, that's going to take a while to get that soil saturated. A lot of the water at first is going to just run down those cracks. So you need to kind of fill that soil profile up, that top 6 inches or so, with moisture again, and that's going to take a while to do that. So get that soaker hose out there, or just let a hose trickle around the tree, move it around the trees. And you're talking not just right by the trunk, but several feet out from the trunk, underneath where the branches are. We talk about the drip line. Those fine roots actually extend out maybe twice or 3 times the height of that tree. So it's really quite an area around the tree that you're really trying to get saturated. And it's going to take a fair bit of water if that soil is really dried out.
Just give it a good soaking.
Good thorough soaking. You know, we talk about 1 inch of water a week. You know, start by putting on a good inch of water. If you're using a sprinkler, you can put out some little cans or something to see how much water you've applied. Maybe let that go for a week and then do it again, just to try to begin to fill that profile back up with water if it's thoroughly dried out.
Okay. Thank you, Dave. Connie, good to have you with us tonight.
Thanks.
What do you have for us?
I have some tomato problems because I went out to my garden and I went, I should have maybe been checking this before. It's been a busy summer, so I didn't pay much attention. And I'm thinking probably other people did somewhat the same thing. So some of the things I'm seeing and things that have come into the clinic, tomato bacterial spot. You're going to see it on the leaves, the stems, the fruit. It's typically when the warm temperatures and the high precipitation. So earlier on you might have seen some of this, and it'll still be there. It might not be doing as much with the drier weather, but you'll still have the symptoms. Tomato early blight is showing up, which seems weird because it's late. You'd think it would be late blight, but it's early blight. There again, it affects the foliage, the stem, and the fruit. So it usually starts on the older leaves. So it'll kind of work from the bottom up. It'll kill the whole plant. So if you see that, you want to rip it out of there. Get rid of those plants. Just destroy them completely. Look for resistant, tolerant varieties for next year. You know, be a little more careful what you plant. Rotate them into a different spot. Control any weeds. Get rid of any volunteer tomatoes. You know, that's all things you're going to have to do for next year. The other thing that came in that is not something I've seen very much of is a fusarium wilt. And that one, you know, is really controlled by resistant varieties. So really, if you see that where you get maybe one side of your plants dying, and it starts about now when they're between the blossom and the ripening of the fruit, if you see that, there'll be a darkening on the stem. And you kind of can see that in the picture, and that's really what you're looking for. So if you see those, get rid of them. You know, don't put them in your compost, just get rid of them. Okay, and rotate out of that spot. Don't plant there again next year. The last one I have is some environmental stresses. Just some goofy things that show up just because we had hot temperatures, they were growing fast, maybe there wasn't enough water at the time, just whatever. So just odd things that happen, little cracking, little weird stuff going on, and just, you know, all those little imperfections that none of us like to see on our tomatoes. There is a nice publication called Managing Plant Diseases in the Home Garden, and that can be found either with your county extension agent or you can go to the SDSU Diagnostic Clinic website and you can view it from there. So it kind of helps you with if you want to put chemicals on. Not everybody wants to do that, but there are some options.
Okay. Now, a number of times we'll have these symptoms show up on some of the plants, and the plant itself may not be doing too well, but it has tomatoes on it. And the question is, can we use that fruit, or should we use that fruit?
You know, some of it you can. I'm of the mindset if I can cut it off of there, I'm using it. You know, that's really, I don't put chemicals on my garden, so I expect to have some disease and some blemishes. Most of that stuff you can. You know, you don't want to put disease stuff in your canning because it could keep it from processing correctly. So if you're going to cut it off, make sure you cut off all of it. But yeah, I guess for me, I would use it.
Okay. Bacterial spot, they're okay? The fruit on those?
They don't usually ripen very well anyway, okay. So.
Answers the question for us. All right. So, thank you, Connie. Mm-hmm. Mike, what do you have for us?
Well, Dave was kind of talking about the effects of the, flooding and that sort of thing, the wet conditions. One of the effects of the wet conditions has caused problems that a lot of you are dealing with this year, and that's crabgrass control. A lot of people asking, gosh, what, you see all this crabgrass, and crabgrass loves wet conditions. And here we have a picture that might be similar to your lawn right now. Nothing you can do about it now. The only thing you can do is wait till next year. Put down a weed and feed type, herbicide fertilizer mix last week of April, first week of May, or right before the lilacs bloom is the general kind of rule of thumb. But and also, Dave mentioned last year, is now's the time to be reseeding. And now we want to kind of strategize here, because if you're going to get serious about weed control, you got to be very serious about thickening up that lawn. One thing you might find, if you can dig out of your shed, is that old garden weasel, which has really no use for anything. But one thing you could use it for is filling in those spots in your yard, those dead areas, which is going to be your future weed patch. Go in there, kind of till those up a little bit with that weasel or something else that you might have. Just scuff that soil up, sprinkle the seed in, pack it down, and you're good to go. I did this last year in my lawn at Brookings, and the next photograph you'll see here about a month later, nice seedlings coming up, grass coming up, and that'll be nice and thick for next year. Because the problem with crabgrass control is when you put that crabgrass preventer down next year, you can't seed your lawn after that. That's one of the drawbacks to those weed and feeds. So if you have areas that you're thinking about reseeding, do it now. Get that done now so you're ready to go next year with your weed and feed crabgrass preventers to get those crabgrass seedlings out of your lawn next year.
Yeah, crabgrass is really coming on strong.
Oh, it just had a heyday this year. Loved that wet weather. So let's kind of start preparing for some of that type of stuff for next year.
Thank you.
Yep. Oh, Steve,
yes.
sorry to interrupt you.
Go ahead.
Thing. State Fair coming up this week. We'll be out there, our weed booth in the Expo building. Look for the booth full of weeds. If you've got weed questions, weeds to identify, come on out there. I think we'll have an entomologist. I think Kelly Tillman will be out there on Friday. So stop by and check it out.
Where's your weed booth at?
It's in the Expo building near that stadium. Just
so look for the Expo building on the maps.
That's right, and we'll be there.
Very good.
Yep.
Thank you. Thank you for bringing that up.
Yep, no problem.
As long as Mike is willing. If he's willing to bring back samples, we'll identify anything.
And that happens as well. In fact, with technology, you know, we can take out our cell phones, I take a picture, send the email out, and boom, it's amazing what we can do with some of that stuff nowadays. So absolutely. Any questions, fair game.
Good. The first two questions are just what you were talking about, Connie. They come from Dimmick and they come from Eureka. Tomatoes, big splits on the top of the tomatoes. And I know you mentioned that as far as environmental conditions. Can you be a little more specific on what might be causing that big splits on top of some of the tomatoes?
Actually, there's a couple things. It can be environmental. It can also be varietal. Some of the beefsteak varieties will get those big shoulders and they'll get those cracks. So without knowing what their tomato is, it could be just that reason. But it can be, you know, when we had all that hot weather and those tomatoes were growing really fast and they couldn't take up enough nutrients and water, so that causes those splitting and cracking to happen.
Okay. This one of them, they did say like a 650, 720, Champion, and Better Boy tomatoes.
And usually those two varieties aren't really bad for that, but so that was probably environmental, all because of the heat and the water.
Okay. So nothing they can spray or treat for. Just like
just
Mother Nature is doing its
Yeah,
thing.
you're just going to have to deal with it. And
all right. Dave, this one comes from Volga. How to store potatoes?
Well, potatoes are kind of an interesting vegetable that you want to store. A couple things to keep in mind. You need to store them in a dark place, and not real dry. You want to have some humidity there, but keeping them in the dark is probably an important area. We often talk about a root cellar, or you might have had parents that had root cellars where you're trying to store them down below ground, where you have a fairly consistent temperature, probably around 55, 50 degrees, somewhere in there. That would probably be the ideal. So you want a dark place, moderate humidity, relatively cool is what you're trying to shoot for. You don't want to put them in a refrigerator. That's going to be too cold, but in that mid-50 range is probably going to be the ideal. But that's tough for most people nowadays. Most people have completely finished basements, and they don't have a nice, cool place anymore to store those kinds of things. So, you know, potatoes are one of those crops that a lot of people love to grow. They love their potatoes, but if you don't have a good place to store them, you might find that halfway through the winter that most of your potatoes have sprouted, or they've dried up and gotten really difficult to work with. So storing potatoes is kind of a tough thing to do. And I like potatoes, but not a big, huge fan of potatoes, so I just pick mine up at the grocery store. And my parents finally got to the point where they decided it wasn't worth trying to plant the potatoes and fight the potato bugs and all that other stuff. They get them from another grower. They've got a good place to store them, but that's kind of a tough thing for a lot of people nowadays.
Okay. This one comes to us from White. They have hybrid willows, and they'd like to know as far as cutting saplings to replant. I assume they're going to try to get them to root and replant those at another time?
Well, willows are one of those plants that is one of the easiest things in the world to root because the stems have preformed root initials along the stem. So when I was a kid, my grandfather told me that he had started the big willow trees that were in our yard on the farm by sticking a willow switch. After getting the cows home, he'd use a willow switch and he'd stick it in the ground, and sometimes he'd forget to pull it back out again, and it grew into a tree. It's like, Grandpa, you can't do that, but it turns out you can do that. So if you want to start some willows, the easiest thing to do is probably next spring, just go out there and cut some branches or some good-sized twigs, probably about 6-8 inches long or so, maybe about the size of a pencil, and just stick them about halfway down into the ground in your garden someplace or where you actually want them to grow. And with the moist conditions that we have in the spring, typically that's going to be enough for those to root, and you're going to probably get a pretty good shot at getting most of those to root and start out as new trees.
Okay. Washington Springs, John, they have fruit flies in the house.
Yeah, this is a common one at this time of year, and unfortunately there's no real great easy answer to it. And so I end up preaching sanitation on a lot of these, and that's going to be your first line of defense against these. They're going to go after anything that is remotely edible for them. And by that, I mean it can be pretty far gone and nothing that a human would ever want to eat, and they'll still go for it. So any of that produce that's sitting out, maybe it's gotten a little bit old, you want to make sure all that gets cleaned up, thrown away, and out of the house. Those are great places for them to want to get into and lay eggs and try to raise some young there. The rest of that is just more of the same sort of thing. You want to clean up that trash. You don't want to leave food scraps around. If you've got a garbage disposal, maybe make sure that everything gets cleaned out there. And they are attracted to lights at night a little bit too. And so if you've got some of them maybe moving outside, your trash can isn't too far from the house or something, you have a light on in the house overnight, they may come to that light at night and be attracted to that. Beyond that, there are some fruit fly traps that are out there. People make some homemade ones that rely on a fruit juice usually that starts to ferment a little bit, and you let it sit out and you use soapy water to trap those fruit flies. Those sorts of things can have some effect, but you're still going to have to clean everything up to really have great success on it. And other than that, chemical sprays most of the time are fairly limited because we'd be applying them near food that we would want to eat, and we don't have many options for situations like that. But if you can find some indoor type insecticides, you can use those as well and try to kill some of them.
Occasionally we have people say, well, garbage disposal, sinks, and we put bleach down there and it doesn't do any good.
Right, and if that's the case, they're probably simply not coming out of those places. It's a case where you might think they are, but chances are you've got something else sitting around that is attracting them. And it can be, because of the size of them, it can be a very small amount of food, and it's enough for them yet.
Okay. Washington Springs, John and Connie, maybe between the two of you here, they have brown spots in the lawn. The grass is loose, the roots are gone. What could be the potential problem?
Well, I'm going to guess summer patch or grubs. There's two things there that could be doing it, and the reason I think summer patch right off was because I had a sample. They peeled up just chunks of their turf. No grubs involved, but perfect for summer patch.
Yep.
But it could be grubs too, so you'd want to check.
Yeah, and you actually want to dig those up and do a little looking, and we've got two kinds of grubs, so to speak, that would be fairly likely out there. We've got the white grubs, which are large C-shaped insect larvae, and they will go under the ground there and take the roots off of the plant entirely. And so if you're digging it up, you hopefully will find some of those grubs, and if not, you'll notice that all the roots are gone. The other ones that are fairly common are bedbugs, which are much smaller. They're not C-shaped, they're usually straight, or very close to straight, kind of a light cream color or white color as well. And they feed more in the crowns of those plants. Talked about it last week. The crown is where the leaves attach to the roots. It's that central part of the plant. They feed in that area more than they'd feed on the roots. And so if you've got crown damage like that, chances are you've got bedbugs, and hopefully you could find some of those too.
Okay. That might be something sometime is round tables to show a graph of a, or a diagram of a grass plant, and actually show them where the crown is at and the difference between grub and bedbug damage.
Be a good educational opportunity, wouldn't it?
Yep, it would. So, something to think about.
Absolutely.
Mowbridge, Dave, when and how to prune a forsythia bush and the best time to plant peonies. They have two questions there.
Okay. We'll start with the peonies first because that's the one that we can do pretty much right now. If you've got an old peony that you want to divide, we often get the call from somebody that said, well, we sold our house, we're moving, can we dig our peony out and move it? The month of September, we typically say, is the best time to try to divide peonies and move peonies. The plant is pretty much getting ready to shut down for the winter. The crown and those big fat roots have stored up pretty much as much carbohydrates as they're going to have for next year. And also the buds are going to be next year's shoots are well developed at this time. So now's a good time to get out there and dig those plants up and divide them. When you do that, you want to be careful of those buds that you're going to find just about an inch below the soil surface, that you don't want to break those off. And you also want to be prepared to dig a pretty hefty hole and have a pretty sturdy shovel, because those roots can literally be 3-4 inches across. They can get to be pretty massive. So you want to try to maintain as much of those roots as you can, but especially the buds and the roots around those buds. Be careful not to damage those too much. Replant them again so that those buds are about an inch below the soil surface. You can cut the stems back to just a few inches just to give you something to hold on to and kind of see where they're planted. But now's a good time to do that. As far as the forsythia, the best time to prune forsythia is right after it's done blooming. Or you could also prune it during the dormant season. So after they lose their leaves, that's a good time to go out there and prune them back. What you're going to do, though, is you're going to sacrifice your flowers for next season. It generally takes probably at least year-old wood, oftentimes 2-year-old wood, to really get good flowering from a forsythia plant. So if you can do some, if you have a massive plant, like we took some down at McCrory this spring after they got done blooming, we probably aren't going to have a lot of flowering for them next season. We might have some, but probably the following year is when they're going to really look good. But we did that right after they're done blooming. Now is probably about the worst time to do a lot of major pruning with our plants. As I said, we're getting ready for winter. The plants are getting ready for winter. When you prune them now, you're going to encourage new shoots to develop, and those aren't going to have time to harden off before we get the freezing temperatures. So if you got to do major pruning, hold off until leaf drop, until the dormant season, or with forsythia, do it after they bloom next spring.
Okay. Connie, this one comes to us from Rapid City, and they have some pumpkins. What causes powdery mildew, and what can they do about it? And they have some of the plants that have that, and they're concerned about, is the fruit going to ripen?
Well, it probably will ripen. The powdery mildew is just coming because we've had so much dew and humidity. It's just perfect conditions for that. It stays on the leaf too long, those spores can get going. Just the perfect environment, especially on crops like that that just get so solid with leaves. Okay, so there's not much you can do. There are some like baking soda type sprays. You can mix up your own home concoction and try to slow it down. They should ripen fine though. There shouldn't be a problem with that.
Okay. Now, I do believe the baking soda recipe is on the Garden Line website.
I believe so.
So they can go on there and print that off if they wish.
It kind of works. If they have a really bad infestation, it's probably not going to help them, and they're not going to get rid of what's already there.
Yeah, you can't reverse anything. It's more of a preventative measure.
Prevent and try to stop or slow down.
Now, can it get bad enough to where it'll affect the stem of the pumpkin, to where the
well, it doesn't really affect the stem. It gets bad enough where it just kills the leaves off, and so then you'll start to see the whole thing die back.
Okay, good. Thank you. Composting. The compost, frozen 7 to 8 months. Should I cover it to keep it usable?
This call is coming from Antarctica?
Yeah.
Okay.
This is coming from Sturgis.
Well, if they've got room in their freezer to store compost, I guess I'd just go ahead and put it out there on the garden and try to till it in if you've got a spot that you want to use it. If you've got a bunch of it that you want to still store, probably the best thing to do is just kind of let it dry out and store it in some bags or some garbage cans or something, and then you can use it when you want to use it that way. But I wouldn't worry about trying to freeze it or anything. It's already partially decomposed, so it's relatively stable at that point. So just use it when you can, and if you can't use it right away, just hold on to it until you got a spot for it.
Okay. This next one comes to us from George, Iowa, and it says Naked Lady. And I believe they're referring to the plant.
Oh, okay.
So, yeah. And they say plant or seed, how to plant it. Which do you prefer?
Well, I've tried growing naked ladies in the garden. This could get a little interesting here. But there's a few different plants that are often referred to that. The most common one that you're going to see is a Nerium lily. It's Nerium, I believe, or I-E-M is the way you spell that. It's called naked ladies because the foliage comes up in the spring, it dies down, and then you get the flowers later on in the summer. Another plant that you might see sometimes referred to that is autumn crocus or colchicum. Same thing, they put out a massive foliage in the spring, that dies down by midsummer, and then the flowers come up usually about mid-September or so. For both of those, I think the best system is going to be to buy the bulbs and plant the bulbs. Nerium is a little bit tender for us here. I've tried planting it several times in McCrory and generally not had much luck with it, but down in Iowa they might have a better chance of getting them to survive. Maybe doing some mulching around those plants, put some of that compost, call that caller from the last one, and get some of that compost down there to give it a little extra winter protection, and you might have some better luck with it. But usually rated about zone 5.
Okay. Mulbridge, Connie and Dave perhaps here. They have a Colorado blue spruce. My needles on my evergreen tree are dying up towards the trunk of the tree. The needles on the ends of the branches are okay. Would that be a needle cast?
Well, the one thing that we talk about a lot this time of year, and especially probably in the next few weeks, is that most of our quote-unquote evergreens are going to start dropping needles. That's a natural occurrence that happens, and it's going to be the oldest needles on the plant. With a spruce tree, I think those needles live for like 5 years or so, and then the oldest needles start dying off. So you're going to see that on the inside of the branches and work its way out. So you should be able to, if you look back at a branch, every time that branch forks, that's generally another year's worth of growth. So you should see several years worth of growth out there that's fine and healthy. And if you're just getting the interior needles showing up, browning, that's happening now or just beginning to happen now, I'm guessing that's probably what you're dealing with. But if we're seeing other symptoms, and maybe Connie can give us some other ideas of some things to look for, there could be some diseases there.
Yeah, there's some needle blights and some different things, but I think like Dave does, I'll bet anything, it's just the natural dying of those oldest needles.
Especially if you look at the tree and you look at other trees in the neighborhood or at your neighbor's trees, and they're all doing it at the same time, that's going to give you a good hint that, yeah, this is okay, this is nothing to worry about. But if you've got parts of the tree that are doing it and parts of the tree that's not doing it, then I'd be a little more suspicious.
Okay. I know I have one in my yard. You can see it just has the 1 year's growth, so I think I have a needle cast problem more so than seasonal needle drop on that. So.
Now, there's several diseases, needle cast diseases. If you actually have that, you're going to see, if you look real closely, you're going to see little black-colored spots showing up at the base of those needles. And there's a variety of other diseases that you'll see symptoms on the branches and so forth. So check out the pattern. That's the pattern in diseases and insect and pest problems is really crucial in diagnosing those kinds of things. And again, if you see it in your tree and it's all over in your tree and all the other trees are showing it, don't worry about it.
Okay, good. Thank you.
Unless you're in Pier and the water just receded, then I'd be in trouble.
Location. So, well, up next, Garden Line paid a visit to N.E. Hansen Research Gardens with Extension horticulturalist David Graper. We learned that grasses are not just for lawns, but can be used as a decoration. Dave highlights several varieties of ornamental grasses fit for the South Dakota climate.
Living on the prairie of South Dakota, grasses are a natural feature that we see in the landscape. And many of them can be very readily used in our ornamental plantings to add interest to the landscape during the summertime as well as into the winter months. There are dozens and dozens of ornamental grasses out there on the market, and we want to just focus on a few of the ones that might be adaptable to your area. The first one is ribbon grass. This is a grass that's quite adaptable to many kinds of locations. And if you want something that's going to grow fast and give you some good ground cover, this is a plant that's going to work very well for you. Most of the ones available have this variegated foliage with the white stripes down the leaves, which is quite attractive. They don't really produce much of a seed head, but they just have this nice green and white foliage most of the summer. If it gets too dry, you will see some browning in the plant. So it likes a location that's going to be maybe even a little bit shaded, or at least get some extra moisture during dry periods. Switchgrass, everybody's familiar with switchgrass with all the information about trying to use this to produce cellulosic ethanol, but it's a great plant to have in the landscape as well. There are a number of cultivars available. This is one called Heavy Metal that has kind of a blue-gray foliage color and kind of a reddish, very fine textured seed head. Makes a nice plant about 3 to 4 feet in height, stands up quite well. works very well in the landscape. Prairie Sky is another variety that's available. It has a more greenish appearance to it, to the seed heads especially, but again, kind of that bluish color to the foliage. Again, a plant about 3 to 4 feet high, makes a nice mass planting or a specimen plant use in the landscape. The silver grasses or the miscanthus are advertised a lot. We've trialed these both at our Annie Hansen farm and also at McCrory Gardens, and haven't had very good luck with hardiness on these. They do have a very beautiful seed head. Some of them have variegated foliage, which is also quite attractive, but we're just a little bit on the northern fringe. But if you live in the Sioux Falls area in the southeast, you might try some of these. You'll find them available at most nurseries and garden centers. They really have a graceful silvery look to them. They get real frizzy. The big blue stems are another good plant for us, and this is for if you're looking for a plant that's going to be tall. It's called big blue stem for a good reason. These plants often will get 6 to 8 feet in height. They again, the selected varieties have more of a blue-gray, blue-green foliage color to them, which will turn a little bit darker colored in the fall. They have what we call a turkey foot seed head to them. Again, not for the little border next to the house, but if you got a bigger bed, you want to put some of these in there to give some interest and height, the big blue stem might be a plant for you. Another native plant that does very well for us here in South Dakota, along with some of the other plants that we talked about today. These can all be great additions to your landscape and really make your garden attractive.
Well, Dave, thank you for that little segment that we had there. Do you have any follow-up comments you want to make? Or?
Well, a couple grasses that maybe didn't get highlighted as much on there as they could have. One is little blue stem. There's about a dozen really good varieties of little blue stem out there on the market. Little blue stem, the species, is a native in South Dakota. A lot of good things coming out with some of those plants. And there are many, many more varieties of the switchgrass that are out there. And again, switchgrass, a native grass here in South Dakota, a lot of interest in that grass, not only for its ornamental value, but also as a potential biofuel crop. But both of those are fantastic plants in the landscape, and there's many, many other ornamental grasses. That just showed you a little sampling of some of those. And there's a lot of other ones to choose from, but whenever you're trying some of those, try to get some good information as to how hardy they are. Hopefully McCrory Gardens will participate in an ornamental grass trial along with a bunch of other states across the country. We're still kind of working out the details on that, but some of those grasses, they look great in the catalog and they look great maybe sitting on the shelf at the greenhouse, but they just aren't real hardy in some areas. Like I mentioned, some of the miscanthus varieties. I've just had very poor success with those in Brookings, but again, in Sioux Falls, you can get by with a lot of those. So try a few of those. Don't go out and buy 100 plants to fill in a big area, do a big mass planting. Try a few for a few years first and see how they survive in your particular garden, because some of them may not do as well as others.
Okay. Very good. So, well, as all the other weeks, we do encourage our viewers to send in either emails, questions, or pictures to us on some of the problems they're noticing in their yard or their garden. And this week's no exception. We have a few that came in. In fact, this one is kind of a carryover from last week, where they had their mother that planted some miniature white pumpkins in 2010, left a seed there. Some volunteer plants came up, and this year they have a white miniature pumpkin, but it's the shape and the size of zucchini. And I believe we have some pictures here that we can show. And Dave, do you have any thoughts or comments on that? As far as we kind of want to know, is it one or the other, or a combination, or can that happen? And
well, I think certainly you can see some of the potential for some hybridization to go on there just naturally. But the other side that comes into this is that many of the varieties of squash and pumpkins and gourds and things that we plant are hybrids. And when you see that next generation coming back from that seed, you're going to see some of those parental plants, some of the genes of those parental plants showing up in the offspring that grow up. So I don't know enough about these plants offhand to say, yes, this is a hybrid between a zucchini and a miniature pumpkin. But you're seeing definitely some different genetic makeup there showing up in those plants. So whenever you have plants that come back from seed and they're hybrids, or if you've had multiple different kinds of plants growing together, you've got that potential for a natural hybrid to kind of develop, and you're going to get some oddball stuff once in a while.
Okay. The next one is from Pierre, Mike, and what they have is a patch of goldenrod, about 30 feet at its widest point, extending 100, 120 feet long. While they really enjoy the summer splash of the yellow from the color of the goldenrod, they are concerned, or should they be concerned about, could this get out of hand and get too far or spread out too wide, and controlling it. They've noticed a few other kind of isolated plants starting to show up outside the patch. So,
well, yeah, and Dave was talking about a nice segment there on some native grasses. Well, there's also native forbs that can be somewhat desirable, and goldenrods are generally native, and so they can become a problem in grazed pastures, but in a grassland like this, probably not a problem, you know, maybe somewhat beneficial. Some of the birds and wildlife may feed on this. Adds to the overall diversity. Even by bringing insects into the system, creates new food for some wildlife. So probably not a problem in your area. I wouldn't worry about it. Some people watching, you know, in horse pastures and in pastures, the goldenrods can build a little bit. Escort is the general chemistry for that, but you got to get it early in the spring when it's small. Goldenrod's a very tough weed to control. You got to get it small, and Escort is generally the best herbicide for that. But in grassland situations, leave it alone. Enjoy the color. It's a nice native to have around.
Okay, good.
It seems like it gets forced out after a short period of time in
Sure.
really heavy grass.
Yeah, and you might see it come and go a little bit based on the seasonal conditions, but it shouldn't be a problem in a grassland situation.
Okay. Next one's hot springs. John, we have some pictures of an insect here. They say it's eating their sweet corn, and they like to know what should we spray or apply to get rid of it. They think it might have eaten the leaves on their zucchini. However, I don't see any on the zucchini leaves, but most of the leaves are gone. And then they kind of go on to answer, I think, their own question, that we also have a lot of grasshoppers that they could have eaten the zucchini leaves because they've eaten most of everything else in the garden. So,
Yep, they nailed it. The zucchini leaves, I think, almost certainly eaten by the grasshoppers. This insect is actually a scarab. It goes by the common name of a bumble flower beetle. In flight, particularly, they look a little bit like a bumblebee. They flash some yellow when they open up those wing covers, and you can see some of that yellow showing up there on them. And the pitch, when they're flying along, humming along, it's very similar to the pitch that a bumblebee has as it's flying. And so they get that common name like that. Common insects in sweet corn at this time of year, they get in there and do a fair amount of damage to some of those crops. And they'll get into a number of other garden crops like that too. They can move into tomatoes at times and other fruits like that too. As far as control of them, it's almost impossible because of their mobility. When you go out and look at them in sweet corn, you open up that husk a little bit and they fly out of there and take off, make you think of that bumblebee right away. Same thing when you're trying to spray these things. They will just simply fly away, and avoid that spray if they can, that disturbance. Even if they get hit and you manage to kill those that are there, the next day you've got a whole new crop coming in. So with those pre-harvest intervals on corn and on other vegetable crops, not an easy thing to control, and probably in most cases you don't really need to do a lot of control for it. In those cases where you wish you could, unfortunately I think that's about what it is. It's going to be wishing that you could do something more for them.
okay. The next one comes to us from Rapid City, and the graphic is of a tomato plant. And Connie, it looks similar to what you talked about with our round table this morning, or this evening. There's no blossom end rot, they indicated that. The mulch plants receive weekly waterings. All 9 plants, different varieties, have shown this type of damage. This is the first year the problem's occurred. What may cause this problem that you see in the picture? Is there a question?
Well, I would look at it for that fusarium wilt. That would be one of the things if the stems have that browning inside. The other thing is the early blight. And I can't see the leaves close up enough to know for sure, but it's probably one of those 2 things. And then the best thing now would be to get those plants out of there. Don't let that inoculum stay, and get them out now. Sooner the better. So you say get them out of there. Garbage Take
can,
out the plant
completely?
garbage can out. Don't compost them. Burn them. Throw them in the garbage, but don't
rake up any leaves that are on the
rake
ground
up
too?
all the leaves too. You don't want to leave any of that residue behind.
Okay. Does tilling help at all with? with that? Or?
It helps a little bit, but it's already in the soil. The other thing you want to do is rotate. Don't plant in the same spot next year. Move your tomatoes to a different area in your garden. Look for varieties that are resistant. You know, really work next year to eliminate some of that, and don't let any tomatoes come up from seed on their own.
Okay, good. The next couple of questions here come to us from Rapid City as well. They asked about putting nitrogen on grass clippings in the garden. And we said as long as that they're put on top of the ground, it isn't a problem, or it wasn't necessary. What they're wondering about is, what if they till those into the garden?
I don't think you have to worry about it at all with grass clippings. Generally, they have a high enough nitrogen content in them that they're going to break down very nicely on their own. And they'll actually, if you till them in when they're still fresh, probably have a better chance of actually supplementing the nitrogen content in the soil just a little bit. So I wouldn't worry about it at all with grass clippings.
Okay. The other question is, they've been told that planting creeping thyme in the flower beds, it will help choke out grass and other weeds. Do you have any thoughts on this? And I have a hard time keeping the grass and weeds out of my flower beds now. Would this be a useful solution?
Well, I don't know if you want to comment on creeping thyme. I'm guessing not, unfortunately, but I don't know if you had any experience with that plant.
Yeah, I think if you've got a weed problem in your flower bed, planting creeping thyme, while it's a nice little plant and it will fill in areas that are pretty much where nothing is growing there, I don't think it's going to get to the point where it's going to get rid of the quack grass or get rid of the brome grass or some of those other things. However, if you do have a stand of it in your garden, it's less likely for quack grass and brome grass and crabgrass, even for that matter, to get established in there. So it will help keep things out, but I don't think it's going to get to the point where if you got a bad weed problem, you say, oh, I'm going to plant creeping thyme and it'll kick everything out of there. That's not going to happen.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, anything you can do to thicken up that flower bed will help some of those late flushes of weeds. But we've tried different cover crop type things as well, and you just can't get those things to cover quick enough in the spring. The weeds come on so quickly that they get a jump on it. Even if it is a perennial, it still has to regrow again to cover that area, and we just haven't been able to find anything. And we certainly would love to, but we just can't. So, but for generally thickening things up, prevent some late flushes. Can't hurt.
Especially grasses, they're able to kind of come up between that foliage and those stems so easily. Probably do a better job of outcompeting some of the broadleaf weeds that you might have in your flower bed. But that's the grasses that seem to be the real tough one to deal with in a flower bed. And unfortunately, you just got to think about renovating that bed, take out the plants that you want, do some thorough cleanup in there, and replant and try to get rid of them that way. But if you got a bad weed problem, it's a tough time.
Okay. The next question comes from Sioux Falls, Mike and John. First, over here, organic gardening. What can be used for bug control on cauliflower, broccoli, and so on in the garden? And then the next question, we'll go over here to Mike. Also, what can be used to control weeds organically in the garden? So, John, you want to start with that one?
Well, I'm glad that they said the crops they did, because on those cabbage crops like that, the main insect pests that we're going to be dealing with are some of the caterpillars. We've got a few different species. Probably the most common one here is the imported cabbage worm or cabbage white butterfly, or it goes by a number of different common names, but it's the caterpillar, those white butterflies that you see flying around the garden all the time. We get some loopers that come into there as well, but all of these are leps, shortened form of lepidopterans, and honestly they're fairly easily controlled with some of the BT products. If you go out there and you look for those BT products, it's a bacterium, and you can apply it to those crops and it will take out those caterpillars and control those pretty nicely. Occasionally we see some aphids appearing in those crops as well. Those are going to be harder to control, but our main ones will be those caterpillars.
So you have to put the BT on every time it rains, or how does that work? Does it have to get on the caterpillar or what?
There are a couple ways of doing it, and really the caterpillar should end up eating this product. But there are a couple different forms out there, and if you really get into researching them, you may find that one form is considerably more expensive than the other. And the expensive one is going to have the live bacteria in it. The inexpensive one will have the toxin taken from the bacteria and purified, and you're applying just the toxin. The live bacteria, the advantage to that is that when it kills the caterpillar, it multiplies. And so when the next caterpillar comes along, you've got a lot more of it already there waiting for that caterpillar to eat it. If you just have the toxin, you're going to have to reapply. And if it rains heavily, you probably have to reapply when it rains.
Okay. All right.
What about weeds?
On to weeds. Options for weeds as well. You know, one thing you might want to take a look at is corn gluten meal, if you can find it. Surprisingly, that's a little bit tricky to find. You might find a commercial preen product at some of the big hardware stores, but if you can find it from a local lawn and garden store, you might be able to get greater quantities. It's marginally effective. It's something that you put down in the soil before the weeds come up. But it is organic and it has some activity. Now, it's not going to give maybe 50–60% weed control. So it's not going to do everything, but it may help. Of course, mulching is a good thing. Another thing between the rows, if you want to kind of minimize soil disturbance, flaming. There's some flamers you can get, little handheld flamers to kind of get in there. And if you do kind of singe the leaf of your vegetable, that's not the end of the world. But mainly for those small weed seedlings as they're coming up. So,
like a torch.
Yeah, like a little torch type thing. And so very entertaining, that instant gratification while you're at it. So not a bad thing there. Tools out there, hula hose, stirrup hose, things like that. There's going to be a lot of tools out there if you look to make that weeding process a little bit easier. So corn gluten meal, getting good mulch after those plants get established. Before that, maybe some flamers, hula hose, some of those tools that we see out there. A lot of things a person can go after, but it's still labor intensive. So nothing super easy, but some options available.
A few options out there.
Bad.
Okay, good. Tyler, Minnesota, Dave, hostas, they need to be moved because they're tearing down a garage. Can they be divided at this time of the year, or should they dig the entire plant up and move it?
You can do pretty much whatever you please with those hostas, and they're going to probably survive. They're one of those really tough perennials. Ideally, you want to try to do it, I'd say probably irrigate those plants pretty thoroughly a few days in advance when you want to move them. Try to dig them up as carefully as you can. If you want to divide the plants and replant them that way, you certainly can do that. You can break them down into individual plants or little small clumps of plants, or you can try to move the whole clump. But I think if you're going to dig up some big old established plants, you're better off to do that division process right away, as they're going to get to be better plants in the long run anyway, because they're probably getting crowded and causing some issues there. So divide them, plant them now, make sure you water them in thoroughly. Now is actually a good time to do that because you're going to give them some time to get that root system reestablished before the ground freezes this fall.
Okay. The next one, Connie, is an apple tree. They have some leaf problems. The apple leaves have many spots on them, a yellow ring with a black spot in the center, or dot in the center on the leaves. The apples seem to be okay, the fruit itself. What may be causing this, and treatment suggestions?
Well, I don't know, is that apple rust? Would be my guess. The treatment, nothing you can do now. It's too late. That spraying should have happened. I guess I'm not exactly sure on the timing. It's in the spring, either right as the flowers are opening or right in that time somewhere. I believe there's literature on the internet there on one of our sites, so they could look it up. But for this year, it's a done deal. There's nothing they can do. They may want to go in and clean up any of the leaves, that fall and do a good sanitation practice. There's probably a cedar tree fairly close by, and as long as it's there, they're going to keep having the problem.
Okay. John, this comes to us from Hartford. They've lived in this house for 15 years. The last couple of years, they've been getting earwigs in their home. Why, and how do we get rid of them?
Yeah, that's the other one that I get a lot of calls on, bedbugs and earwigs, I guess. Earwigs are really an insect that has shown up in the last few years. The earwigs that we deal with commonly around here are not native insects. They're a Eurasian species, and they're moving from the east to the west in North America, and they're reaching here now, and that's part of the reason that we're seeing the increase in numbers. It's one of those things where if they can get into a house, they'll take advantage of that and find some shelter there, but they're really not going to do much damage inside the house. It's just people don't like having them in there. So if that's where you're at, the best way to try to keep them out of there is to do just that. Make sure that those doors and windows are sealed up as best as possible. In an older home, that's going to take a lot of caulk and some replacement parts, replacement door sweeps, and maybe some weather stripping around those doors, and some time to try to seal that up. And then beyond that, clear the vegetation away from the foundation. You want 18 inches from the edge of the vegetation to the foundation. That should help remove some of that potential for them to come in. Barrier type insecticides have some effect on them. Unfortunately, they may cross them and die inside the house rather than dying outside.
So just follow some of those procedures. And no real bad issues with those, just more of a nuisance than anything.
They'll end up eating some plants around the outside of the house, but they're not really an issue inside a house, except people don't like them.
Okay, thanks. And that's all the time we have for this evening. Just to let you know, Garden Line repeats twice each week on South Dakota Public Broadcasting Digital Channel 3, also known as the Create Channel. The encore broadcast can be seen Fridays at 11 a.m. Central and Saturdays at 4 p.m. Central. Be sure to check your local listings to find SDPB Digital Channel 3 where you live. And now we're going to wrap up. Thanks to our panel of experts, John Keykafer, Brookings County Extension Educator, David Graper, Extension Horticulturalist, and Connie Tandy, SDSU Plant Diagnostic Clinic, and Mike Meckning, Extension Weed Specialist. Thanks to our volunteers, the Watertown Master Gardeners, and thanks to you for watching and calling in. On behalf of the entire crew, have a good evening and happy gardening.
Funding for Garden Line is provided in part by your membership in the Friends of South Dakota Public Broadcasting. And by Swiftel Communications.